So good morning and welcome to today's seminar. It's a real pleasure for me to introduce Rosario Tomasello, who is a researcher at the Freie Universität in Berlin, but he's also family, sort of, like we were saying, because we had him as a guest last year, and we are having him again this year, but we are also collaborating with him. We are collaborating with him because Rosario is one of the most prominent scholars in neuropragmatics. And in particular, he's working on an aspect which is very central in pragmatics, namely speech act, but nevertheless under-investigated in experimental research, particularly at the brain level. Compared to metaphor, irony, and scalar implicatures, speech act is definitely less investigated experimentally. Yet, like I said, it lies it's at the core of pragmatics. In addition to his studies on speech acts in the brain, he's also doing research on clinical populations, also cutting-edge research involving patients undergoing neurosurgery procedure. So a number of different techniques are applied to tackle this issue, and we look forward to hear more from you today.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, and welcome also from my side, and thank you very much for the really nice introduction. And actually, I want to thank you and also Andrea Moro for inviting me here, and also for the nice interaction we had already since I'm doing also a research stay for 2 weeks. I mean, a short one, but we had already a lot of exciting and motivating interaction, and I'm looking forward to have more actually, because I'm still here a few days. So speak to me, interact with me, and I'm really happy to do that. And yeah, but let's get started with with the real stuff, we can call it, or science in a sense. And as you can see, actually, I don't know which kind of title went around, but I think it was the general title about neuropragmatic speech act. But at the time when I was asked for the title, I didn't know what exactly to present, since I was presenting here already. And so I was thinking to be a bit more specific. And also, I mean, when you call it neuropragmatic speech act, of course, one could also assume and expect that you're going to explain everything what speech act is and how all the different characteristics, but this is not true. Actually, there are different characteristics of pragmatics, and I'm going to list some of them. But for today, I'm going to focus mostly on the action sequence structure of a speech act. And I'm going to explain you what is meant by that in a second. Therefore, as you can see, the title is The Neural Basis of Action Sequence Structure and Speech Act Understanding, and what kind of role this action sequence structure plays during understanding communicative action in that sense. But let's get started with a really simple example, and specific to understand what is the relationship between a linguistic utterance and its possible communicative function in different contexts. And let's imagine there is a speaker and a listener, and the speaker utters a sentence such as, "The soup is cold." In that case, of course, the listener will not directly grasp what is the intended meaning of the speaker, because such sentence can actually be used for different intention. In a sense, it can be understood as a statement. For example, the speaker wanted to describe that the soup is cold. It can be understood as an indirect request, in the sense that you are using that same sentence to request someone to warm up the soup, or it can actually also understood as a question. Basically, if the speaker in that case is actually putting an emphasis or raising the intonation at the end of the sentence, this is typically understood as a question, especially in Italian, actually, where prosody plays an important role in that case. So this is just to show you a simple example, in the sense that there is a one-to-many relationship between the linguistic utterance, so the same sentence, the same linguistic structure in a sense, and semantics, and the multiple communicative intention that can take on as a function this sentence. So you can use the same sentence in different contexts and have different intention, different speech types. Okay. But I mean, one could now ask, well, how does the listener actually really grasp the real intended meaning of the speaker? Well, we know that during interaction, during social interaction, there are a series of pragmatic cues that we typically use to decode and or to understand or help us to understand what the intended meaning is of the speaker. And we know, for example, that the context and the scene plays an important role. So if you are in a restaurant and you are actually uttering the sentence, the soup is cold, well, to someone working there, well, for sure, most probably this will be understood as a request and not as a describing the soup in that case. But it's not only the visual scene and the visual context, but also the linguistic context, in the sense that all the information that you got linguistically before the sentence was uttered, that might play also an important role and might help you to decode what is the intended meaning of the speaker. Well, another level could be body language or non-verbal communication. So gestures and facial expression could help also to decode what is the intended meaning of the speaker. Prosody, I gave already an example. We will go into that a bit more in detail. And another element is common ground, in the sense the shared knowledge between the speaker and the listeners. And it's not only the knowledge, but also the belief, the assumption, and the commitment of interacting with another person. And this is just 4 elements here. Of course, this could be, we can add actually other further elements or more fine-grained elements, but these are actually the main cues which I have used during my research to define and to decode, actually, to let the subject understand if the speech act has one function or another. But actually, although these pragmatic characteristics are important to decode what is the intended meaning of the speaker, there are other pragmatic characteristics that plays also an important role, specifically to distinguish between one speech act and another one, okay? So, and one of those is actually the action sequence structure, which is the action that typically follows a speech act, okay? And I will give you an example about that in a second. And the second one is the commitment and assumption of the conversational partners, in the sense that there are specific assumptions that the partner and the speaker makes during interaction, and that might be different between one speech act and the other one. And well, you can think about if I request an object X to a person, well, I assume that perhaps the person is willing and able to follow my request. If I know that the other person is not able to do that because perhaps he doesn't have the object that I would like to get, and I know it already, I will not make any request, okay? So there are specific assumptions, or the commitment of naming or describing something. I commit to the truth of the sentence, okay? I say the sentence because I believe that the soup is cold, and I commit to the real truth and description of the doing things. So there are this kind of difference at that level. And actually, in this accepted paper, in the special issue organized by Valentina, well, I discussed whether this difference in commitment assumption might lead to difference in theory of mind processing. But that will be for another talk. That's why as I said, today I'm going to focus on the action sequence structure. There are many different characteristics of pragmatic or speech act. Today I will go just on the first point. And well, let's have a look a bit more closely what's meant by action sequence structure. And let's take now a more simple example. Okay, now it's the partner. There are 2 partners, and the speaker is actually uttering a single word. Okay, in that case, a single word such as cookies. In one case, as a naming, so the speaker is naming an object. In the other case, is requesting an object using the same label, cookies. Okay, in the same context with the same speaker. Well, the typical action that typically follows a naming, one could say, well, what we expect is actually that the listener B, in this case, looks at the object and gives a sign to have seen the object, okay? However, there are other actions that can follow. For example, B can also correct or clarify A's utterance in case the label used by the speaker is not the correct one, or maybe the sentence is not understandable. So there are other actions that can follow typical naming, but if everything goes well, typically what you expect is that B looks at the object and gives a sign to have seen it. In case of a request, well, the action that we would expect is completely different. In fact, if I say cookies to get the object, what I would expect is that B follows the request by grasping a cookies and giving it to me. So giving it over or handing it to the speaker in that case, okay? So it's another action that follows typical request. So this makes the two speech different in a sense, the function, the aim of using language in that case. But of course, I mean, the action following it, it's much more complex than request because actually B can also reject or deny the request because maybe it's not willing to do that or it's not able to do that because there are no cookies left in the kitchen, or maybe the cookies were done with love by the grandma and he doesn't want to share it with the speaker, for example. Okay, so there are many different assumptions from B in that case. And then, of course, we could have another tool like that is shared with naming. In this case, B corrects A utterance or clarifies an A utterance. Okay, this is shared between the two speeches in this case. So what we see here is that there are, in case of request, the action sequence structure is much more richer. In a sense, there are many different possibilities can follow. In case of a naming, it's less. And in this case here, we have a more focus on the object itself. In the other case, I mean, the focus is on getting something. Okay. Yeah.
You tell me if it's the moment to ask this question.
No, please feel free to interrupt whenever you want.
Before presenting this slide, you talk about action structure.
Yes.
And then here, interestingly enough, you say dialogue structure, which I understand, and action sequence, which I understand. Why do you need to express the term action structures rather than action sequence?
Ah, sorry. Did I say action structure? No, I think it's action sequence structure.
But anyway, why do you need structure and not only sequence? I know it's a tricky question, but it's crucial to me. Okay, we're not playing poker, right?
Yeah.
So let me tell you what's in the back of my mind.
Yeah.
There is the worry that's not on your side, or those people who think that sequences of actions are ruled by the same grammar as sequences of words. Plainly, it's Müller and Fadiga. So I think that you are completely disjoined from that hypothesis.
Yeah.
And so, if so, then I think that this is neat. You have action sequence, dialogue structure, but you don't need to have action sequence structure.
Okay, I see the point. I think I put them all the three together sometimes to make it clear that there is a structure in the sense that one action, verbal action follows another action in a sense, and this is one small bit of structure in a sense, but of course not like language. You heard structure and it's already. But actually, we can discuss this actually more because it's interesting. There are people, Levinson et al., they speak actually that the action sequence structure of a conversation resembles and actually is actually even more complex than the syntactic structure that we have in the brain. But this is,
indeed. I mean, digesting an egg is far more complicated than saying yes. But okay, anyway.
But that's But thank you for making this. I'm always like. Yeah, I think terminology is really important, and maybe it's confusing having both because it's actually the action sequence only and not maybe the structure itself.
Thank you.
But what I wanted to add, and maybe I will not go much into this, is that the intention assumption. I made already actually some differences about that. But in a sense that in the case of a naming, the speaker A assumed that the label is that he or she is using is the correct one, for example, and it's understandable. Or here, in this case, that the person that is requesting an object assumes that the other person is able and willing to do that, okay? So at this level, what I have discussed, but I mean, there is not so much evidence for that. It's maybe between this and two, there might be some difference in theory of mind level. Maybe between this and two, there might be other differences, which I'm gonna explain you here with this picture, with this cartoon, which I think makes it a bit more clear what is meant by naming and request. So let's have a look again at the action sequence structure. So what you expect after a naming is actually that a person looks at the object, okay? It switches the attention from A to B, and B will be the object that has been named by the speaker. And the final interaction will be that both speaker A and speaker B, actually, they speak about the object, for example, the color, the form, or in this case, the smell, okay? And therefore, as you can see, well, the focus here in case of a naming is the object itself. While in case of a request, you expect someone else that is grasping the object, the cookies in this case, and gives it to the speaker. Now, from this actually really simple linguistic analysis, okay, of the action sequence in that case, okay, it's really simple actually. If you think about it, it's a bit trivial, but we could have already a precise idea what we would expect at the level of the brain. Okay, why? Because in case of naming an object, the focus is not the object itself, on the cookies. Therefore, one could expect that some semantic brain areas might be more active in the case of naming, such as the temporal pole or the parietal lobe. Okay, they are areas that have been shown to be activated for object perception. Okay, and semantic features, specific semantic features. In case of a request, since the focus is on getting something, okay, you might have some semantic network activation, but you would have also additional area activation, which is at the level of the motor cortexes, because you expect someone doing something for you, grasping the cookies and give it over. So actually, just based by this linguistic analysis, starting from linguistic theoretical modeling, actually, if you think about the classical one, and also on the interaction level, actually we can have already an idea what would we expect at the level of the brain. So this will be the basis, the starting point. Well, although it's important to know which area where in the brain things happens, another big discussed question is actually when, the temporal component. So when are actually linguistic pragmatic information processed in the human brain? Okay, and this is actually highly discussed in the neurolinguistics and neuroscience of language, but also in pragmatics, is because there are these two different models that have been proposed. One is the so-called serial and cascade model by Federici and al., in which they find that when you hear a sentence here in this case, the soup is cold, you have first a phonological access or phonological processing in the brain at 100 milliseconds. This is followed by lexical processing at 300, and before syntactic also really early, but then semantics comes at 400 milliseconds, which is linked. The ERB component is highly investigated, and 400 in that case. And only at the end of this, you have an interpretation and situation model code, which they define that this is the pragmatic information processing in that case. Okay, really late. But on the other side, you have this additional model here, which is the so-called instant and parallel models, which say, well, maybe all of these levels here, phonological, lexical, semantic, syntactic, are crossed all at the same time, in parallel, within 200 milliseconds, so really early. I'm not committing neither to one and the other one. I think more I read about these models and the standard one, which is still the defined standard, this one, and instant model, I'm still thinking, and plus looking at many different evidence that are coming out recently, I don't know whether, I think both of them are not really correct in a sense. I think like that perhaps each level of those, each level, the phonological one of semantic as the syntax, as the pragmatic, might have some difference between different types of syntactic processing, for example, different type of pragmatic processing. And in fact, with Valentina, we are actually working on that direction to understand whether basic speech act that I'm going to speak today, because they are really basic, if you think about naming requests,
some always say that there is an equal.
Yeah, so.
Okay.
The basic speech act I'm going to show you here today, which are really basic if you think about naming, requesting, question, statement. I mean, they are processed really early. I'm already telling you the results of this talk. But of course, if you take pragmatic information processing that are a bit more complex, indirect speech act already, for example, metaphors, maybe things happens a bit different in the brain, and they might need more elaboration, they might need more processes. And maybe the same thing would be in syntactic processing. I mean, if you have a simple syntactic structure, maybe it's actually processed really early, as Federici and al. believes, but maybe if you have something more complex, it might come later, but I'm not an expert in that case. So I believe that each of these boxes should be seen as an independent, and of course then to get a full picture, but they went directly from the full picture instead of having the fine-grained difference. So this is a bit my idea, but it's a bit of speculation because I don't want to make it. But actually, my data, we will show you, fits more in that direction. want to add?
Just because, why do you have reanalysis rather than analysis?
Here.
No, on the top, the second top most, yeah.
Because
Why
they believe that syntactic processing happens really early, at 200 milliseconds, and after you have done all this process here until semantics.
You mean they, because the Tomasello is the other one?
No, this is Federici and
Sorry,
Pickering.
I just can't see.
Federici, Angela Federici.
No, I know her.
Sì.
And actually, she was here for quite a time, but I couldn't see it. Okay.
Sorry, they are small here. This is I reworked this picture to make it clear, put them together.
Yeah, but
That's why the citation is down for
I
me.
don't understand why Angela said reanalysis. It's completely nonsense, right?
No, she did because she has this idea of the ELAN, which
Mhm.
is basically the
No,
only one of
but
three, and then, which is the early syntactic parts,
Right.
and then it's 600 milliseconds.
Okay, and then you have syntax scattered all over, you know.
Which is a global checking of the correctness.
Yeah.
So,
that's
okay, so it's reanalysis if and only if the sentence could not be realized in the first.
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know what, I'm not an expert on that, but I don't think, or maybe yes. Yeah, but this will be like the
It's more global, yeah.
This is the 8 line or the 5th line.
No, I mean, one would have said it's a syntactic rescue. That I understand.
Yeah.
So in that case, I would understand.
Yeah.
But otherwise, the reanalysis, which is not in the case for all sentences. If I couldn't get me the cookie, I mean, there is no reanalysis.
Yeah.
Okay, I understand. Yeah. It's reanalysis.
That's completely different.
Yeah. What was it? Okay.
But these are the labels used by Federici and
No, but
so it's not my labels.
Yeah, we wrote papers together, Angela and I, and she never came up with this idea.
Ah.
But probably because Noam was there, and then.
She couldn't.
Problem. But I agree with what you just said. It was not contrasting your position to that. I mean, it was very clear what he said.
Yeah.
I think it's.
I mean, I had many ideas what could happen in the brain, but I don't think it's or a mixture of both, or maybe we should look each box separately first to have the global picture.
Even connectivity analysis.
Yeah,
even could be consistent with that.
Yeah. But it could well be that actually you take this one, what Federici said, and you squeeze it here.
Yeah.
So there is still the seriality processing, but it's not maybe with a gap of 100
I
milliseconds.
completely agree.
So it could also be that actually really precise both they are not, let's say. But we have these models, they have been discussed quite a lot. And now about pragmatics, it's interesting because this model says pragmatic happens within 200 milliseconds. This model says it happens at the end. So actually it's the best test case to see whether it's late or early, you know, because it's in the two ends. So this is at the beginning and this at the end. So it's actually looking at pragmatic information processing is actually maybe one way to see which one is correct. So is pragmatic processing rapid or actually a slow process? And to answer those questions, especially also where in the brain, I have conducted a series of studies. And one of the first study, I focused mostly on the naming and request. These are really basic speech in a sense. They're using single words. So I say cookies to name something or request, and based on the context, linguistic context, or body language, non-verbal communication, people or subject were understanding this as a naming or a request. And I have done some study in production, but also in perception. So first-person perspective, third-person perspective, but also second-person perspective. And in both cases, actually, when we look where in the brain, what we see consistently is that request leads to bilateral motor cortex activation. So that the motor cortex is more strongly activated when you perceive or you understand that the same label is a request instead of a naming, okay? Because the label is the same. It's actually cookies, okay? At the level, it cannot be that those differences is at the level of semantics because we use the same label. So it's really well controlled in that case, okay? So the idea is that perhaps this bilateral motor cortex activation might reflect, okay, the action following a request, okay? The fact that you expect someone doing something for you in that case. But let's have a look actually at the temporal component because this might give you a bit better an idea about the motor cortex activation. And in the temporal component, so in a non-verbal communication. What we used here is actually gestures because the gestures, they will have the pragmatic information, will give you the pragmatic information, because in literature, at least they define that children, before they are able to utter words, so before the language comes in, or at least probably in production, but it comes in already in perception, the children start to communicate with gestures quite a lot. And specifically, they use the pointing gestures typically to name things, and the give me gestures, the open hand gesture, to actually to request things. And the interesting fact is that they start then combining language, one words, when they are in a one word stage, they start to combining single words with gestures. So they start building a syntactic processing with non-verbal and verbal communication. So this is actually quite highly interesting. So what we decided is like, okay, these are really basic speech. They emerge really early on in children before they're able to speak. Let's have a look at the brain responses of adults in this case. And we presented those to adults. We used the EEG, the electroencephalography, and we measured the brain responses. And what we found out is that the pragmatic information processing happens really early on, and are processed fast in the brain, because after the onset of the stimuli, here at 0, we found clear differences in brain responses at 150 milliseconds. So the red line is the brain response for request, the blue line for naming, and we found a bigger, a stronger brain response for request as compared to naming at 150 milliseconds already, really early on. Okay, we found, of course, some difference on the third time window, but nothing else later on at 400. And you can see here the time window is at 600 milliseconds. So Federici was saying pragmatics happens here at 1 second. Okay, it's even not on the picture. Okay, there might be something happening there, because actually I didn't look at that. So it might be that there is some pragmatic information wasn't happening there. But the interesting thing is that if we look here again, by doing source analysis at the difference, so if you want to know why request shows a stronger activation, you could use source analysis, which give you an estimate where in the brain something happened. It's not precise. It has typically an error of 1 centimeter they speak about, but actually it's good enough to give you a pictures what happens in the brain at this time window, okay? And of course, you need to use high density electrodes in that case to have a more precise localization. But what you see here is again that already at 150 milliseconds, the motor cortex is already active for request as compared to naming. So there is more activation in the motor cortex bilateral for request as the naming. Okay, so it seems like that the expectation that something will happen or what will follow a request is part of the meta representation for a request. Okay, so the action sequence, and I will not use it any more structure in that case. Yeah.
There is something I missed in the design. So you just held out the word cookie with no intonation, and you had a sign pointing or asking. And that's
It's not acoustic. Actually, it's actually visual.
visual. Okay, you see cookies. You have to
Same label. Yeah. Cookies.
And you have something.
Cookies. Cookies. Yeah. And it's not so. What you think about is that this difference here is because of difference in visual processing. Because if you think about the open hand, maybe it's a bit more complex at the pointing one to see it, perceive it. But actually, we presented also the gestures alone without any semantics. Okay, to have an idea of how will the subject understand only when they see pragmatics. Okay, because the gesture tells you the pragmatic information and intention. No semantics in that case, and in that case, we found differences later on. This means that actually the visual, if it's something visual differences because of the picture, this is not here, but it's later on, and therefore we have this control condition at the visual level. Okay, so to make sure that it's pragmatics in that case. So you can think about if you do this and you don't understand the label, it's a broken communicative function maybe, and this happens later and the brain needs more time actually. Because people could think like, yeah, but if you have only this without the label, you have less information, so the brain should be faster. No, it's actually slower because it doesn't grasp the full picture that you are doing. Yeah.
It's totally incompatible with the location of activation, but it is a clear sense, linguistic sense, in which naming versus request make a difference. So in the underlying linguistic structure, in one case, it's just their sentence, there is a cookie. So on the other hand, in the sense you have a request, a question, a question that you will either peripheral elements, and then you have can you give me a cookie, or is it like cookies? And in both cases, you activate a layer part, which is related to, more discourse.
Yeah. I agree. Yeah.
But it could be an imperative.
With that.
Yeah. I mean, it's
You
a
understand?
request. The request as an illocutionary force doesn't tell you if it has to be in terms of structure, a question, or an imperative.
How can you take a question? It's give me a cue. I don't know. Give me the cue.
No, I don't know if you can really
That's
infer
correct.
that behind it.
What's naming? Give me the cookie.
That's key. The naming is.
No, okay, maybe I should clarify a few things. So the pointing gestures in children, it's most of the time it's understood as a name. How you do that actually? You observe how the caregiver reacts. Okay, if the children does this, typically the caregiver react when looking at the object. So this is the way how they acquire the function of these basic gestures. If the children start doing this, the caregiver takes the object and brings the children and give it. So they learn this association in that sense.
Again, if there's a command versus a request, that's interesting.
Yeah.
For the command, then we would expect to have a much lower structure, while in the request, we have an higher.
Yeah. So that's the idea, but pointing is actually polyfunctional. I think later on it gets a bit more multiple function. And actually, since years I would like to do a really simple example, because my opinion is that the semantics defines the function of the gestures. Because if you point to an elephant, I mean, it's naming, okay, because you're pointing to an elephant, but if you point to a hammer, well, it could be understood, typically maybe understood as a request. So actually the pointing can have many different functions depending on the content of, so it's much more complicated than this, but at least we see this kind of early difference activation between the two and this motor cortex activation, which is in line with the previous study we have done in single words and in different contexts. Would you like to?
Yeah, two things. One is a funny thing, namely, since we're Italian speakers, there is one gesture which is missing, which is this one.
Yeah.
No, but it's kind of true. I mean, which is ironical, but makes sense.
Yeah.
But besides that, there is one thing that I have in mind. You are now using a language with very poor morphology clues.
I will come to that.
Okay.
Shall I go on and then maybe we discuss that?
Yes.
Okay.
Then maybe I add if I.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
So indeed, what I did as in the next study, I moved from single words to sentences. Okay, because actually that is especially the point that many people might make. Say, yeah, but you're using single words. I mean, typically we use sentences that has some more syntactic information, morphology. And also one could say, well, maybe because you're using single words, you get this early activation, but if you add on another level, syntax, morphology, then maybe you have much more processing that you need to do, and maybe this will come later, okay? So the differences in brain responses for pragmatics might come later. And therefore, actually, I mean, it's a small step, I would say. It's not specific, because the nice thing would be to compare different syntactic structure and have an orthogonal structure, but let's see. But actually, the next step, what I did is actually use sentence like Maria has free car with different intonation, okay? And in a rising intonation at the end of the sentence is typically understood as a question, while a falling intonation at the end of the sentence is typically understood as a statement. Okay, this is well documented in linguistics, in phonology. It has been shown in many languages. And specifically in Italian, the nice thing is that in Italian, we don't need to, there isn't even not the change, the word order change, like the verb in the first position, such in German and in English. And therefore, we actually decided to do this study with Italians, because their prosody seems to play an important role, okay? And so what we did, we presented those sentences to the subject. We used again EEG. And what we found out is now that actually the brain reacts a bit earlier, a bit faster. At 100 milliseconds, we found no differences. But after the noun onset is actually basically the last word on the sentence, okay? Because there where actually typically is understood whether it's a question or a statement, and where we see also bigger difference in prosody, in perception. The nice thing is that the difference we see here at 100 milliseconds, so stronger activation for question as compared to statement, is actually in line with the difference in prosodic contours of those sentences. So the red line is the rising pitch for questions, and this is the falling pitch for statement in that case, and there is where we found out this difference. Now, again, I like to control everything in my experiment, so now I want to say again, well, this is maybe not pragmatics, but it's maybe, e.g., sensitive to acoustic differences, okay, purely. So it could be that those differences actually are due to the physical acoustic difference of those sentences, okay? It could be, well, it's not question that is going up, but what we see there is reflecting the difference in acoustics. So what we did here, again, we had a control condition. Here maybe we had a control condition, actually two control conditions. We had a low-pass filter signal where we filtered out the semantic and syntax, and we had just a humming. So it's like, People were still able to classify them as a question and a statement, but we didn't find any differences in brain responses, so we could make sure that this is actually due to pragmatics. And then we had also musical sound, because I thought, like, maybe we should have also a condition that it's not speech related. It's something that is not speech at all. And we took a note, I think I took a note of a piano. I constructed it similarly to the sentence, and then I copied the prosody of the critical sense into that, okay? And then we presented those two, and we didn't find any significant difference there. But let's come back to this picture here. Now I did, again, source analysis to this difference here, and I said, okay, why there is strong activation for question? What we found out, again, is that the motor cortex is, again, activated for questions. So you can think about questions are actually requests of information, okay? You request someone to give you information. And we found motor cortex activation again here, as in similarly to request for an object. And this was great because, I mean, there is big discussion in linguistics about whether questions can be seen as a request of object. Okay, if you follow CERN classification and terminology, he was putting request and question in the same box as a directives. Okay, but there are many people, and I believe it's a proper discussion. Many people say that questions are broken assertives, because actually they get complete when you actually, when the answer comes in, it's then a complete assertion. Okay, so they behave differently than requesting an object completely. Also, if you think about it, when you ask a question to your friend and the friend gives you the information, there is an update of your common ground, which is not in case of requesting an object. So there is big discussion about that. But what we could show here is that the motor cortex, okay, is active also for question, and therefore shows some similarities with request of an object. So it speaks more about SIR classification. I come back in a second to you, but I want to show you this now, which is really important, because now by looking specifically the locus of activation for requesting of an object and requesting for information, we see that the locus is two different locations. When you request for an object, what you expect is that your partner does something with the hand. It takes the cookies and gives it to you, and specifically the hand motor cortex. So the part of the motor cortex that is controlling the hand, so if you move the hand into the scanner, specifically this area here is activated during the movement, but now it's activated during the understanding of a request of an object, because you expect someone doing something with the hand. In case of a question, what you expect from your partner is that the partner does something with the mouth, that articulate words, okay, that give you information. So the action comes from the mouth, from the articulator. And in that case, we have the articulatory or the face motor area activated. So if you go in the scanner, you move your hand or you move your lips or your jaw. In that case, you will see this kind of activation, and we see it here during the understanding of a request and a question. Okay, there is this kind of somatotopic activation, depending what you expect.
Two short observations. One is, of course, I agree with you. I mean, it makes sense what you saw, but there are kinds of questions that are like, are you sad? Which do not involve any action.
Yeah.
And then one has to contrast also this kind. I name these kind of things because we use the same setting after Buccino et al. experiment.
The
where-
2005 or
Yeah, where Marco Tettamanti was
Mhm.
involved in San Raffaele. I was only following by that time.
Mhm.
And, we contrasted when studying negation, we contrasted sentences of the kind, grasp a knife, bite an apple,
Mhm.
with I admire sincerity, or, this kind of thing. So you still have to take apart questions that involve movement from those that involve abstract situations. Like, are you happy or are you sad? First thing. The other thing.
Maybe I can answer this really shortly.
Yes.
I forgot here what we tested is not all the question, but polar question, where you expect a yes/no answer. That's the.
Right, but still, are you happy is a polar question. But
Are you happy is a bit tricky because why are you asking are you happy? Because you think that the other person is not happy because something happened. So there is all these things involved.
Well.
But if you ask like, is Maria
Sad.
shopping?
No, you don't have, you just forget to use about something that needs an action. Is Maria fair?
Yeah, okay.
I mean, you have to contrast with.
No, we didn't check that, and that would be something interesting.
Yeah, you see.
I totally agree.
I can give you the results we had for those sentences that didn't involve any fact. And the other thing goes back to the.
So I didn't show any motor activation?
No.
Ah, nice, interesting.
But that would be an interesting correlation.
Yeah, indeed.
I suspect that it could be a residue due to pragmatics, and that will reinforce your position, Valentina's position, on the precise domain of neuropragmatics. If there is a residue. So we can discuss it later.
Yeah.
On the other hand, a few minutes ago, I was mentioning morphology. And then you correctly pose the distinction between one word versus sequences of words.
Mhm.
But there is still something that can regard single words with morphology. For example, in Plautus, you have, languages that have nominative, vocative, and accusative. Single words may be distinguished between request with accusative or naming. Actually, there is a very interesting study by Marina Nestor on the vocative on proper names. So, for example, in Italian, language that does not have morphological clues, it does have prosodical clues. The example she always makes is something like Marilu ha fatto la spesa. We're all named Italian speakers, right? So you don't need to translate. Marilu ha fatto la spesa. And then you say, chi ha fatto la spesa? Marilu. Then suppose you go in front of a building, you want to see if Marilu is there. What you say is, Marilu. And that's an interesting associated with a question.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that you have single words, sentences, and single words with morphology.
Yeah, I agree.
And that could be a continuum, a stimuli that could reinforce.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah. Indeed, actually, I wrote a follow-up project for the DFG, and there actually I want to look at the interaction at the different level because semantics works within semantics. Pragmatics often works within pragmatics.
Yeah.
Syntax too does look at syntactic processing. But let's have an experiment where all these variables are included in one, and then we can look at those interactions. But I agree that morphology could be actually quite easy to do, like just having this kind of an additional elements in the single words, and then see what the difference is there.
Or being in Germany, you could actually use a system. Yeah,
the German system is rich in morphology. It's the richest, maybe. So maybe it gets even more complicated.
Go to Parliament then.
Yeah. Yeah, please.
You ran another control study, maybe on English, which I think is the easiest thing. So you just write and then you post the auxiliary subject inversion, and you have a clear 100% question is that auxiliary subject inversion, and you have declared the
Yeah. We thought about that. Actually, at the beginning, the idea was to do it with the Germans, but then I was Italian and said, look, Italian, it would be much easier to do such an experiment because you don't need to control for these differences in syntactic. But that's true. The next step will be, let's look at another language where you have two cues, one of the beginning and one of the end. So the syntactic one and the prosodic one, yeah. But let's move on with questions, because the question case are really interesting, especially for the case of common ground. This is a study not yet published, but I hope to get it soon out. And well, common ground is the shared knowledge, okay, between a speaker and a partner. And often this shared knowledge can be, I mean, there are different kinds. There are general knowledge, I mean, communal knowledge, specialized knowledge, if you want to follow Clark in that case, in his book of joint actions. But the nice thing is now to look why is common ground also processed really fast into the brain, okay, when we have something that it's internal, okay? Because, I mean, if you look here, I use context was an external variable. I use body language was an external variable. I use prosody was perception differences. Common ground is something internal, something shared between two people. So it's actually hard to do this kind of experiment because you need to control how you're gonna create such a studies. But actually, the case of questions are actually really interesting because what you could do is you can take the same question, such as which sea borders Croatia, a geographic question, and you use it or as an exam question. So the tutor or the professor is asking the question to the student. The professor, I hope, I mean, typically knows already the answer to the question, okay? But if it's the student asking a question to the professor about materials the student has not yet learned, the student does not yet know the answer to the question. So it's a genuine question. Okay, so you have, in this case, it's really nice because you have the same sentence, a question, the same action sequence following it, an answer, okay, but differences in the speaker knowledge. If the speaker knowledge is the professor, so the professor knows already the answer to the question, while if it's the student, it doesn't know, okay? Is this clear?
Yeah.
And of course, the final thing will be confirmation of shared knowledge, so confirmation of common ground in case of the exam situation. And I believe all the students in use, they always confirm the common ground, right? No.
That's me, the professor, though.
Yeah, okay. And in case of a genuine question, there is an update of common ground, okay? Because it's a genuine question, you are requesting information, then there is an update. So what we did, we constructed this kind of sentences, geographic sentences like which sea borders Croatia, and then you had the typical action following. 60% was correct answer, but of course there are other type of action can follow. Maybe sometimes the student doesn't know the answer or the professor doesn't know the answer and so on and so forth. We presented this as an interaction, so the subject were looking two people interacting, and the person, the character were presenting themselves saying, okay, let's start with the exam, and then the speaker was uttering, was presented visually at in the screen, really short, and was presented one after the other, but we use exactly the same sentence in both conditions. Okay, I will go a bit faster about that because I think I'm really time-wise quite.
Well, it's 45 minutes, so we can have other 15 minutes.
Okay, okay. I will go a bit faster then. But anyway, looking at this sentence here, welches mehr Grenzen quasien, in German, we presented those. I mean, as you can see clearly, difference where we found in brain response was at the second word. At C, here in this case, there is a stronger activation for genuine question as compared to exam question. But the nice thing, when we did this experiment, I was expecting difference already early on in the function words. But we didn't find any difference in functional words, but in content words. The content words are words that are rich in semantics, because it may be there is the need to have some semantic information first to actually grasp the internal shared information to be included during understanding. Okay, so we found here. But of course, what struggled me a bit about the study is why we didn't find anything later on. I mean, actually later on the sentence, I mean, I might have a better clue about which shared knowledge I should take on or not, okay? What would be the answer to the question as a speaker? But if we look at this word here, the second word, we did some specific analysis here. We found early difference there. I will not go much into detail, but if you would like to discuss this more, we can discuss it later on, because I would like to go to the next study. But, well, we show that common ground is processed quite early in the sentence, in the sense. Okay, I'm gonna jump this. I think it's clear what the study says. It's early, at least my studies. But let's go to this question. But I think I created this question. And then I thought like, well, but I mean, this is a bit trivial in this context because I think you might well, you believe that it's important, this kind of basic research we do, because you do this the same thing. So actually I thought like, well, this was a good question for another constellation where maybe you have to convince those people that basic research in neuroscience and language are actually important. But I thought I keep it here, but it's not for you. It's for the outside world, let's say. But let's have a look at a case in which it's important to do this kind of research, and especially in speech therapy for aphasic patients. Why? Because aphasic patients, we know that they are actually impaired at different linguistic level. So because of a specific lesion in the language cortex, okay? Specifically, typically people speak about the percival language cortex. So if you have a lesion here in the percival language cortex, so this is the percival areas, because the fissure, the Sylvian fissure is here, so all the area around the fissure is called percival language cortex. If you have a lesion here, typically those patients shows language impairment at different levels, from semantic, pragmatic, syntax, morphology. And I mean, leave it out the one that, I don't know, I mean, if you have studied these kind of things, the Broca aphasia and the Wernicke aphasia, don't believe on that thing. When you have a lesion, typically we speak about multimodal, multimodal deficits. It's not just production is impacted or just perception is impacted, okay? It's not straightforward like this as the book tells us, okay? But, well, the question is what we can do to help those patients, because, I mean, after a stroke and you have a lesion, there is a kind of quite a lot of recoveries, like that can happen. I mean, spontaneous recovery from the brain, because we know that the brain can rewire, it's plastic, okay, and you can recover spontaneously your linguistic impairments, and you can improve them. But after a year, there are chronic patients, okay? If after a year, those patients still shows language impairment, this is chronic. It means that the brain alone cannot recover, and therefore we need some tools to help them. And one of these tools is actually speech-language therapy. And in fact, the speech-language therapy, typically patients, they systematically practice linguistic means, structure, like word and sentences. And this is typically done with a picture naming task. So the patient comes in, you present a picture, and they have to name them, okay? Or describe an action. If in the card or in the picture there is someone taking the metro, you have to describe it. So you use more complex sentences. And then there is also word-to-picture matching. So please show me the beer, okay? And there are different objects here, and the patient needs to show them the beer, okay? And look here, actually, here there is beer, and beer. So you can make those exercises a bit more complex, in which you have minimal pairs, and therefore when they choose beer, you can make sure it's not at the phonological level or the word form level, but it's at the semantic level, okay? But looking at this and thinking about how communication happens in every day, I mean, how often you name things, it's really low frequent, at least the naming one. Maybe description is something else, but naming, it's really low. And actually, why should those patients that are impaired at different level of linguistic thing just be practiced in one specific speech act on an assertive naming? It's really low frequency. So we need actually speech therapy that are more based on pragmatics and linguistic actions. And in fact, well, Friedman Pulvermüller developed actually a new therapy already in the beginning of 2000. It's called the intensive language action therapy, or known as a CIAT. And this is a patients, it's a group therapy. There are 3 patients and 1 therapist, and they are involved in a card game. Each patient has a set of cards, and the patient wants to request or wants to find out the corresponding card by making a request to the other therapist. It's sort of a memory game, okay? I have a card and I want to find the same card that my partner has. Therefore, I need to request things. And what's happened here?
The real name.
By describing the
By
name.
saying the
Yeah, yeah. In fact, you have, this is really important indeed, it's the patient has to make requests by naming and describing the object that they want to get. So includes the naming exercise as in the conventional therapy. They learn to request to reject the request in case they are not able to fulfill them. They ask questions, another speech act, or actually thanking the others for playing. This is an expressive speech act, so it involves different types of speech act, although it's based on a request communication. Okay, so any interaction. I actually have, because Valentina asked me, like, can you say a bit few things about that? Actually, I have a video which shows you more specific. What happens? Ah, but I cannot play the video with sound if I play it. You cannot hear it. Because I cannot put my audio up here, right?
Maybe I can put it from the Zoom.
I switch it off here.
Yeah, and we hear it.
Okay, for people online, you can read the subtitle. Okay, there are subtitles. We switch on now the microphone and we switch it on when we finish with the video. Okay, I'm gonna stop it here just to give an idea. So you see, actually, this person was requesting for paper. It took quite a lot of minutes to come up with the correct label, at least. This is actually a real good, successful trial, okay? I took really the best one to show you how it worked, but typically it takes also 5 minutes for one patient to request a card, depending on the lesion itself, okay? But you see that this person was asking the paper at this patient doesn't have the paper because the cards are covered by this big table here, and then of course it needed to go to the next one. Because the trial was fast, the therapist in that case was clever and said, okay, I will interact a bit more. So there is more interaction there. So it's like, what you gonna do with the paper? And then of course he said, I will do paper. No, what you do with the paper? I cook, I think after cooking, he says, or something. But then she asks again, but you want pepper or salt? Okay, and then you start making this kind of trick to make sure that the person is actually using this correctly. So this is a typical, okay, but of course, think about it, it's not like this. Typically, this is 3 hours per day for 2 weeks. This is really intense. For the therapist, it's really intense too. Actually, they start speaking like a basic patient after the therapy. But if you have, I will not show it, I can show it to you later on, but if you have patients that are really better in language, they are really mild in impairment, you can do even more complex exercise. This is nice because here it's like they have pictures where there are activities depicted there, okay? And they should ask the other person whether they would like to do it together. So a joint, so planning something together, okay? If there is a picture of a cinema there or of a film, the patient asks the other person, would you like to go tonight to the cinema? If the person has the same card, they say, yes, please, I would be really happy to eat some popcorns and blah, blah, okay? While if the person doesn't have it, needs to say why the person doesn't want to go with the cinema with the person, okay? It's like giving even more, okay? This is for more high, well, patients that are mildly impaired. So you can play around with this kind of things, or you can have also quantity, same object, different size and in quantity. So the patient needs to say, I would like to have 3 bottles, 2 small and 1 big, okay? So you can play around with these things. But anyway, to actually to make sure whether one therapy works better than the others, I mean, you need to do a randomized controlled trial. In a sense, you invite a group of patients And they are controlled to each other. So one group of patients gets actually the conventional therapy, and one group of patients gets the ELAT therapy, the speech act therapy. And of course, you need to control for a series of elements. Here they were matched the duration and intensity of therapy, implementation in groups, always 3 patients, 1 therapist, and also visual materials were always the same. And then we did some tests before and after therapy in these 2 weeks, 2-hour dailies in this case. And the testing was using the AAT score. This is a test typically used in German. It's really standardized. It's the Hafner test. It's to define what the impairment of those patients is in language. And I was actually specifically involved with the EEG. Actually, I said I would like to do EEG with my experimental design to those patients because those patients are actually using speech act. So we should see specific things there. Just shortly, 2001, there has been done already a randomized control study. They have already been shown that CIAT or ELAT works better than the conventional therapy. And you see here, this is the value of pre and post therapy. And after post therapy, you see a better impairment, a better increase, language improvement, sorry, not impairment, after the therapy as compared to conventional one.
The global score of the ACN.
I think it's the global score of the AAT here, yes. Or maybe can be, okay, this therapy works better if you take just the production part of the AAP. In the perception part, there are improvements that are really small because actually they use more production.
You train the production.
Yeah, you train the production, although they have to understand. Yeah,
the convention.
I agree.
We do the same with convention.
Yeah.
The first step, you can with convention training and then production.
Ah, you do first and yeah.
Yes, we do first comprehension and then production. And comprehension improves production.
Ah, interesting.
Yes.
I think, I think there is much more to do, but
Yes.
what they did here, and I was partly involved in the therapy because the therapy is really big. I mean, you have to recruit patients, you need a big team, and everything. It's quite a lot of work. But what we found out here is actually also in this current study here, we found a better improvement in the global score, here in this case of AAT, for ELAT, but we didn't find any improvement for the conventional therapy. Okay, and here's another plot to show you this improvement here.
How many patients?
I think it was 20, 21, 21 or something like this. And there is actually, I forgot to put it, I wanted to put it, but I could show you the lesion mapping because it's important to see that both groups have the lesion in the same location more or less, and there is a lesion overlay mapping code. And it actually looks like it's really similar. Okay, it's all in the left hemisphere next to Broca, so it means also that we had more Broca aphasic patients with production problems. And there were some global aphasic patients too. Okay, but actually, what interesting to me was actually the question: can we observe specific neural changes induced by those therapies? Okay, so I did actually the EEG to both group of patients. One group got conventional therapy and the other one ELAT, and specifically to see whether we can find any differences. And there are already some studies that have looked at those different, have shown differences more at the syntactical level, so meaning construction and word meaning, but there is no study at the level of speech act. Okay, because actually in one case they are doing naming, in the other case they are doing naming requests, questions, and so on. And here I use the same design with gestures word combination. So the pointing gestures and the give me gestures, we know they have a different function in that case, together with the word. And we use this design because we have already data from healthy participants, so we have already a good idea what to expect at the brain level in those patients, and we presented them here. I will go a bit faster because I would like to reach my last slide, and one of my last slides, to discuss an interesting part too. But so looking at the ELAT group, what we found out is that clear specific differences in brain responses before and after the therapy, only for request. So when the patients were seeing the open hand gesture with the words, understanding this as a request, and we found a stronger brain response at 300 milliseconds in this case, difference between pre and post, but no differences for the naming one. Okay, now you could ask why at 300 and your other study was 200. Big complicated question. I mean, there is a lesion, there is a change in balance. I think it's a change in balance between excitatory and inhibitory neurons. And this change in balance, especially also with the thalamus inhibition loop, might have led to differences later on here in this case. Okay, it's not something new what we are showing here. Actually, many people show that a brain lesion leads to slow down the brain responses. Okay, but of course this is speculation. We have just this study. It shows later on, and we can just discuss why it's not earlier. And the interesting thing is, if I do source analysis in those differences before and after the therapy, what I see here again, and this is striking, I was super surprised actually to see that, is again that the areas that are more activated after the therapy are again the motor cortex, bilateral motor areas, here in this case, but also some area in inferior frontal gyrus, so area relevant for language. So it was really interesting. And actually, just to clarify this area that you see here highlighted are not the areas that were impacted by the lesion, okay? The lesion was more here in this side. If you take the overlay of the lesion, they are not included in that area, because one would say, well, are you sure that these are area outside the lesion area? Because otherwise it doesn't make sense. But if you look at the conventional therapy, we didn't find any difference between naming and request before and after the therapy, so this goes in line with the behavioral study. But it opens a lot of questions, because like the conventional therapy, it works. We know that it works. It's conventionalized, it's standardized. I mean, it works maybe not better than the ELAT one, perhaps, but it works. It has been shown to work at least for X patients, okay? So why we didn't find any difference here at the behavioral level, also at the neural level? Maybe there is something that went wrong, okay? So I think, yeah.
Are you sure that it works?
Oh, well, it's conventionalized. It's something that we use already 20 years. It's used in all the clinics. So it should work at least. Yeah. Okay, I'm almost at the last two slides. I want to show you some ongoing projects, because to show you again some ongoing projects. Yeah, I have 5 minutes ready. Some ongoing project to show you why it's important to do this kind of research, neuropragmatic research. One is language mapping in awake surgery. Why? Because language mapping in awake surgery, typically they use picture naming task, okay, to map the brain area that are exposed. Typically the patients say "ka," and then they start stimulating different points, okay, on the brain, depending which area are exposed in that case. But we know again, it's a picture naming task. Naming is not really frequent in communication. So I started a collaboration with the neurosurgery from Düsseldorf, where I wanted to introduce a request task. Okay, now it's not anymore picture naming task, but it's a picture request task, and actually compare the classical naming task with a request task. Same label, same picture, but in one case you name it, in the other case you request. We have a different design to make it a bit more contextualized, to make sure that the patient understands that it's a request they are making. And then we stimulate those areas twice, and then we see, well, not me, I will not do it. I will not even go there and look at it. But I mean, the neurosurgeons in there, and we got already the green light. And yeah, we're gonna start in a few weeks actually already. The second point, oh, this shouldn't be there. Sorry, I will come to that. There's one too much. The second point is on the question, and this is a big question. We solve the problem, because I say solve the problem of the where problem, which Morrow writes always about the where problem. And let's say we know a bit where in the brain something happens and when, okay? But the big question in neuroscience and neuropragmatic neuroscience of language is what? Okay, what biological mechanism underlie the processing of speech act? How does thousands of millions of neurons communicate with each other and leads to such representation? This is a really big question, and it's problematic still in neuroscience. Okay, I have done quite a lot of work at the level of semantics, and I have tried using modeling to explain how neurons communicate to each other and explain evidence for them. And I'm not saying what problem, it's a big problem, because I mean, even Andrea Moore and Chomsky discuss about this in this book, in a small book, in which actually Andrea Moore says the new challenge is to shift from the where problem to the what problem. okay? The what problem is actually the actual mechanism of the brain, how neurons process those information, okay? And Roy was saying mental processes are not yet reduced to neural processing, okay? This was, I mean, informal interaction, I believe, interview-like thing, but I think this is really the problem. It's really like, it would be great if one day we could even measure single neurons while we are doing stuff of millions of neurons in the area and see how they interact with each other. But we are not that yet. And what we can do is actually using modeling. So what I started that project is to understand the biological mechanism of the motor cortex activation. So why is the motor cortex activation for request? I mean, I gave you an explanation about it. I said, well, this is perhaps the action that might follow a request, but we don't know. I mean, it can be also simulation, motor simulation. I mean, if you speak to the people, well, no, maybe the people in Parma would say it's expectation, but other people would say it's simulation. Okay, and therefore, to understand those processes at the neural circuits level of single neuron, how this mental process it can be linked to neural processes, okay? In a sense, neural circuits in that case, what I have been doing is I used a neurocomputational modeling. I simulated those processes of request. In a sense, I present a request, I wait a few seconds, and then I present someone grasping it. So exactly this action sequence simulation. I will not go much into detail today. I'm saying just this because I promised some of you to present some modeling stuff, but I decided not to go into detail. But what we found out by simulating naming a request and the typical action following it, at the neuron level, we found again, if we plot the activation threshold of all the neurons that responded for requests or naming, what we found out again is that request leads to stronger motor cortex activation as compared to naming in the motor cortices, okay? And actually, we took this tabula rasa network. The network had 50,000 of neurons. We stimulate those neurons, okay, with request and naming and a following up action sequence. And then we wait because the neurons, if they are, I mean, we use Hebbian learning. You know what Hebbian learning is? So neurons that fire together, wire together, okay? And of course, there is also anti-Hebb learning rule, which is also important. So neurons out of sync, the link. Okay, not all the neurons, because it's not only an associative network in the brain. There is the need to have another mechanism. But anyway, based on that, we got this kind of an explanation at the neural level. It's one explanation. It's a model. It's a possible explanation. But now we can have also show it about more strongly at the neural level how things happens. I will conclude with this last slide, and I always like the sentence. I think I'm gonna take it with me until I'm deaf. So please put it in the cemetery, in my grave, like, indeed. And I think this summarizes best actually my type of research is actually speaking of a language as part of an activity or a form of life. This is from Wittgenstein. And actually, this is actually Wittgenstein will define it that actually the act of speaking and communicating with others is not like the fact of giving information to the other person, but it's actually, we are actually doing an action itself, okay? It's really woven, language and action are really woven together, okay? But it's a form of life. It means also it's part of the society where we live in, the culture and the background culture and everything. Therefore, there is more work to do in that direction, but I think this kind of research a bit summarizes best the fact in studying of speech. Okay, thank you very much.
We're very happy to tell you before I leave to know that according to Noam, the kind of work you're doing is exactly parallel to what Newton did. Which is exactly don't give up with reduction of gravity to ether and vortex and create models which explain something. And you're doing the same thing. This is what we're doing now in linguistics.
Nice.
And in general, we should do exactly as you said. So thank you for your very interesting.
Thank you for
I
that.
raised my hand to ask a question. I forgot I have to chair that question. So I will start with Cristiana.
Yeah, well, the big question is essentially if you try to compare two models, if you have a serial one and a parallel one, how to bet on the serial one for logical reasons. So the serial one is much more constrained. So you have to prove that the serial one is wrong, then you can go to the parallel one and can easily simulate the serial one. So I think logically, all cameratory strategy would be to first test seriously the serial hypothesis before the parallel one. In this sense, I see, well, the only way we test a serial model is trying to get deeper and deeper in the minimal pair you are contrasting. And there are plenty of things you might want to refine. So let's consider average questions. So questions, there is a difference between question, generally requests, and pointing declaration. It's pretty clear for linguists. But there are many layers that can be touched in terms of minimal pair. There are morphosyntactic layers, there are semantic ones, especially the semantic one. If you look at the average question, not all average questions are the same. Or not yes, no question are different from average questions, something like that. And we expect very different patterns for constant. But also the average question. So one classic, I think, pretty common alternative semantics approach. So you should have a common grammar representation, which is Stalner-Like. So you have a sort of assertion which are compatible with your possible words, testable words, and you want to answer with something that is in your language and share with another someone else. So you have to play around with these tricks in order to tune your context, and if you switch questions or what questions, you have completely different expectations, which you are assuming that we share knowledge. So which border might be surprising for someone who doesn't know which border is under reference. So that's I don't know if explore handling with the whole alternative semantics approach, and that's I think something to look at because it's restrict a lot the kind of question you might want to ask and create what is useful. With minimal pairs, you can see, okay, just send this feature and keep everything the same. That's the only way you see, okay, this process is blocking or not. And that's what favor a way of test. So parallel model can be tested in a serious way. In the sense, everything can be bypassed with Webpack or the other, which is pretty popular. Now with transformers in language modeling, actually the parallel model are the winning one apparently. But if you look at clear minimal pairs, the simplified prediction are completely wrong, especially in terms of semantic processing, compositional semantic processing, and syntactic processing. So I think it's something that you must look at if you want to refine a little bit kind of trigger.
No, I agree. Thank you very much for the comment, and I agree. Since as also Valentina said from the beginning, from the theoretical perspective, speech check, there is a lot. There is many models. From the neuropragmatic perspective, at the neuro level, quite less. It's something that started maybe 15 years ago, 20, let's say, maybe 20 is already too much. But I agree that there is quite a lot of things. But my approach was, let's take the two extreme first and start with that to have a clear picture of what's happening, and then we can go more fine-grained and fine-grained. And actually, another talk would be the typical I do. It's not on the action sequence structure, but it's on the simultaneous processing of two different representations. And what I have done is actually showed in other studies that semantic and pragmatic, they are processed in parallel. And this would be another step for saying, okay, parallel processing might be correct because semantic and pragmatic, they might be processed in parallel. We showed that in both studies, actually, in the gestures one and in the prosodic one too. And this would be a smaller step, let's say, in the direction you were thinking. But of course, we can make things now a bit more complicated and see, okay, adding another layer and another layer, what happens, okay? And sure, the prediction will be completely different, especially WH question. They have another function, they are different. I like it because there is a lot of work to do. So actually, I have still a career, or many careers to do, but I agree, thank you very much. Yeah, the small things, but of course, I'm an expert in pragmatics and semantics, but it would be nice to have maybe thinking about more morphology or syntax and so on, how these things can be included in those studies. Yeah, thank you.
Other questions? Matteo?
Thank you for your talk. And there is an interesting parallelism between this kind of discussion and what we are found in the eye tracker experiments. For example, I'm working on negation, and there is a long tradition that say that negation is calculated later in the elaboration of the sentence. But what we found is that is not really true, but it's very early, the integration of negation. And, but just with a condition that is, you need a proper context. So
Okay.
Pragmatics plays a role, a crucial roles. And so I think that also with other methodologies is really nice to see that the picture can be more complex, and maybe the instant parameter models can really explain better the data. So it's just a comment.
But I wanna say something to my colleagues, to both of them. Pragmatic is not just context.
Yeah.
Pragmatic is the inferential processes that derive a meaning and interpretation from context. So it's not the same as context, although of course context plays a role, but the pragmatic essence is the derivation of the communicative intention, like it's a question, it's a request, it's a naming, or the meaning of an ironic utterance or a metaphorical utterance, and more complex levels of analysis. It's not just the effect of context, okay? It's
a richer communicative context in the sense that there is more information that needs to be integrated, and thanks to this information that you integrate, you can get a better inference what the person is saying. But the same thing is happening with speech aid, because if you think about it, you can use the same words, you have to infer which one. But I agree, often context is used maybe a bit too broadly in a sense as a pragmatics.
But you have a difference between negation out of context and negation in context. I don't know exactly. Yes, in a broad sense, you can call that effect pragmatic, but it's not in a focus sense.
Yeah, actually, I kept a long story short because there is an inferential mechanism that is linked to the context. So I just skipped that part. I'm sorry.
Okay.
And,
No. But I mean,
yeah.
I'm doing this because we are discussing together, and that's a consideration that I was sharing actually with Andrea at EGG last year. Because when the word pragmatic was used, it was used in this very shallow and superficial sense, like a discourse. But that's not the core of pragmatics. There must be some derivation of communicative intention and meaning in order to call the phenomenon pragmatics in a post-Reichian sense. Then if you use a definition of pragmatics that is broad, that incorporates discourse and the textual level, that of course, yes. But I just want to share.
Yeah, but it's but it's interesting actually that if you add more pragmatics, and it seems like pragmatics leads to a faster processing of information. In a sense, you would say the data would speak about that, and that's interesting actually to look at. Maybe when pragmatic is there, parallel models win. When pragmatic is not there, maybe seriality wins. I don't know. That might be something that I mean, there is quite a
the seriality.
Interesting. Yeah, but there is a lot of discussion. I mean, every kind of linguistic phenomenon I look at, there is always this discussion: is it early or is it late? It's like the question. Not about speech only, but I mean,
that's true.
I looked at the digital common ground about behavioral study with eye tracking, and you know that this kind of the visual sharedness experiment with children is also there. Big good discussion about early or late. Then of course this kind of model comes out that try to put things together, which is really important because now we can have a better picture. But still, I think we are not there.
That's true.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we used a lot of time, but I'll take just a moment for a neurolinguistic question, which is these effects that you find around 100 milliseconds, and then in patients later at 300. Would you put them under a specific component, or are they very short in a modulation of activity that cannot be really described as a component?
So I think here's a bit earlier because it's acoustic information. So there is this kind of difference of acoustic information processing and visual processing. So in the gesture, it's 150, I think, 160. It's 100. What I can say from the study, it's typically the differences I found are always positive. So it's a positive response early on, never negative until now. It looks like, although in the past, in the 90s, they were saying everything that's negative means more energy for the brain, positive, it's not more energy, it's nothing. So it means that if it's positive, there is no more brain area activated, only if it's negative. There was a big discussion about that. But actually nowadays we know that the positive activation, peak activation are actually really important in that case. And we found always this kind of positivity. If you look at the peak, they are all positive, the difference will be found out. And it's always around this like P150, P100. So positive component 100 millisecond, 150. I don't know, I would say those components, the P between 100 and 200 are components positive for pragmatics, for speech aid, not pragmatics in general, okay? For the speech aid positive of basic one. Because actually I think, my idea is that if we take speech aid that are a bit more complex, let's say commissive, or you take, and this is something I would like to do in the future, is looking at commissive person. If a commissive is interesting because when you do a request for an object, it's your partner doing something for you. But if you use a commissive, so I promise to fix the bike, it's me. Okay, it's me doing something for you. So there is a different perspective, okay? If I request an object, it's you doing for me something. If I promise to fix the bike, it's me doing something for you in the future. So actually my commitment, it's even higher than when I request for you the object, because your commitment is a third person doing commitment, okay? Saying yes or no. So in that case, perhaps, maybe it doesn't happen so early, maybe a bit later. So I think there is quite a lot of work to do to understand if there is a specific component like the N400. We know that is, if I do a specific study, there is always there, okay? Here in speech check, I don't know if it's like this.
Okay.
There might be a bit more variability. But it looks like for now, early on.
And positive.
Yeah.
I think it's time to thank our speaker and